Well, welcome listeners and watchers to another episode of Further Comments. This one is once again where we have a name of the episode before we start recording. It's a rarity, and it's called DeepSeek and the 7 Dwarf Problems for LegalTech. Damien, we have a special guest with us, but before we introduce our special guest, how are you?
I couldn't be better. Life is really good. Things are going 100 miles an hour, and I feel like I'm just hanging on for dear life. And I think that I'm together with humanity, and certainly in the United States, everyone is hanging on for dear life with tech and with politics. And so here we are. Let's talk about some of the things that we can maybe hold on with 2 fingers with dear life, with DeepSeek and other things. And let's introduce our person that's going to be talking with us, Joe Rayment. Very good to see you.
Nice to be here, Damien. Thank you for the invitation. And Horace, good to see you again.
Great to see you. So for those of you who don't know Joe, the CEO, I think, of a company called Automatise, it's an Australian company that has been working very, very deeply, pun intended, with large language models and using large language models to generate litigation outputs. So Joe, your expertise is going to be phenomenal to help us look at all that DeepSeek is going to be doing and impacting. I thought a nice format for this episode would be maybe we spend the first 10 minutes talking about what is DeepSeek and where did it come from. Then we spend the rest of the time talking about the implications and ramifications for LegalTech. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And before I kick it to Joe, I think DeepSeek is the worst fears of OpenAI manifested. Back in 2023, so January, February of 23, I was having a good conversation with Mike Bomarito. He's one of the guys, along with Pablo Redondo and Dan Katz, that beat the bar exam using GPT-4. And back in January of 23, he said, OpenAI doesn't have a moat. Open source is going to eat their model, and they'll be able to run for a while, but open source will ultimately beat them. That was in January of 23, and ultimately Mike Bomarito was right, and I think he's right on most things, and he was certainly right on this, that open always beats proprietary. Think Linux and Unix. How many things run our world on Linux? And the answer is almost everything, because it's free and it's open source. Back in the day, Linux was fighting against some of the biggest oracles of the world, but Linux won because it's free and open. So I think that what we're seeing play out with DeepSeek is OpenAI's worst fear. And the question is the expensive part, is the value provided by the expensive part, does that value exceed the free, and by how much? The difference between the free and OpenAI's expensive, the difference in value is now shrunk. And so really the question is, what is OpenAI going to do next? But Joe, what do you think?
Look, I couldn't agree more that open source has an economic gravity that attracts developers, businesses, anyone with the skills effectively to be able to use it above that sort of consumer grade. I think in various different verticals, like desktop PCs, you do see proprietary having an edge, but when it comes to business, I think open source, Unix, Android, Kubernetes, React, Apache, we've seen time and time again that those with the skills to be able to leverage these technologies will leverage them. This is definitely going to play out that way. One of the reasons why I feel qualified to talk something a little bit about this is because we've been hosting our models for ourselves for a while now. We at Automatise, we started hosting on our own NVIDIA GPU, the Llama 3 models when they came out. I think there's a very interesting parallel between what happened last year. We'll get into it a bit later, but I really do think that with some of the attractiveness of open source in LLMs for a while now, this is a very exciting and interesting time with many complicated and interweaving factors. So yeah, fascinating time.
Let's talk about what is DeepSeek. So for those of you who have been living under a rock, DeepSeek is a large language model, a reasoning model that's been released by, I don't know how much of this is true because I've been hearing conflicting stories, but a Hong Kong hedge fund who has created this language model on the side as a hobby and released it open source, and the training cost was $5.6 million. Now, there's a lot of conflicting report on, what is a training cost and et cetera, et cetera. But what it's shown is that on the benchmarks, it's performed nearly as well as OpenAI's O1 model. And that, I think, is the parallel moment to Llama 3 that came out last year that performed nearly as well as GPT-4. So the world's really excited. And plus, the benefit of DeepSeek is it is super duper cheap to run. Reports are saying it's about 1/30th of the cost. But Joe, I'm going to throw to you as the resident expert who's been actually deploying these things. Tell us more about DeepSeek.
So I think there's an issue of modality. When people talk about DeepSeek, there's actually possibly 4 things that you could talk about. The very first one is that there's a web application that's become number 1 in the productivity section of Apple. It's directly accessible by consumers. There's a direct API that DeepSeek offer that's available for developers to use, and we'll go into that shortly. Thirdly, it's an open weights model that can be hosted on any cloud. there are cloud service providers that are and will be shortly making it available to consume on their platform. And then finally, there's a flavor of DeepSeek where if you've got your own infrastructure and you're sort of disintermediated with the cloud service provider, that you could host it yourself. I'm going to use that sort of matrix to talk about the other considerations as we talk today. As a language model, it's very impressive. As a web application, it's extremely easy to use and it's seen a lot of boost. As an API, it's unbelievably cheap. So there's a lot to talk about across each of the various different dimensions.
Yeah, I agree. And if we think about the cheap aspect of it, that can't be overstated. That is way cheaper. And of course, if they start with, I don't know if it's 100x or whatever, drop from what it was a year ago to what it is today, and if it goes down another factor of another 100, where are we headed? That is really good for us as consumers. That is us as legal tech providers, service providers, and us as legal tech vendors, people that are building the tech for the legal service providers. All of us win because if there's competition between OpenAI and DeepSeek and Anthropic and Google, the cost is just going to go down. As we think about intelligence just became very cheap and we are all the beneficiaries.
One of the really interesting analogies here is that when Llama came out last year, the OpenAI pricing went from $50 per million tokens down to about 10. Just about a week beforehand. So I couldn't agree more on the fostering of competition and ensuring the affordability of some of these services. The potentiality of being able to build with 50 to 100 times more compute in what you can do in your applications is also fascinating.
Everyone's kind of jumping up and down and getting really excited about it. But where the positive and negative impacts? Where I kind of landed was for VCs and investors, DeepSeek is a negative impact. They've lost lots of value on the investments that they've made, especially in AI startups. For startups who are deep tech, like the OpenAIs and the Anthropics of the world, that's a negative impact. It proves and illustrates that what they're trying to build has a very, very small moat. For startups who are building on top of these models, it's a positive impact. It's easier and cheaper to build things now. Anyone can do it and it's going to be faster. And so I think this is kind of where legal tech benefits, because most legal tech are not deep tech. Most legal tech are not trying to build their own models. And then the other people I thought about are academia, super excited because it's the first open source paper in like 2 years. But I think most people are benefiting from DeepSeek.
Yeah, I agree. And we've been talking a lot about cost and the cost plummeting, therefore benefiting the law firms and the legal tech vendors that provide those law firms. So cost is one vector. And I think security, which we're going to talk about more, the possibility of taking this and putting it on a laptop, unplugging the laptop from the internet, and then just letting it think away in a very secure way, assuming there's no back doors, and that's a big assumption, but assuming there's no back doors, being able to do that securely within the laptop itself, that is a huge boon.
Joe, maybe you can spend a minute talking to us about how DeepSeek was trained, the distillation that was done, and why it is so good.
So first of all, there's two models of DeepSeek. There's DeepSeek v3, which had some widely reported cost figures around their training process. It's an interesting mixture of experts model that uses a much smaller number of active parameters versus the total number of parameters that you can find inside the model. When it comes to the data corpus, we actually don't know what data they trained it on. My gut feel is that you won't see any major house releasing their corpora anytime soon until the fair use versus intellectual copyright theft question is being cleared up. It's just painting a massive target on your back. That being said, though, the fact that they released the novel training methods in that paper I mentioned means that other labs will almost definitely, they are definitely going to be attempting to reverse engineer it, and we'll learn a lot more throughout that process. I know that there's a great initiative in Hugging Face at the moment.
It's done.
Kidding. Wow.
Yeah. Nope.
Oh, fantastic.
Yep. It's lightning. I mean, it's like Damien saying, it's so fast.
Yeah. And exciting. A lot of the security problems that are in the Chinese model, which we're going to be talking about, the Hugging Face model wouldn't necessarily have, because essentially it's distilling from the distillation. So maybe any of the backdoors that the Chinese model might have had, maybe the Hugging Face version would be able to eliminate those backdoors. There is security concern with the hosted model of DeepSeek, and anything data goes to China, beware. But of course, local, less of a concern unless there's a backdoor. But of course, the Hugging Face distillation of DeepSeek, the odds of a backdoor are going to be much, much smaller. So yeah, these are exciting times.
Distillation is an interesting term. For those of you who might be listening that haven't heard that before, distillation is where you use the output of one model to train a new model. You're effectively using synthetic data. And it's highly effective when you've got a more advanced model to train a weaker model, or when you're attempting to train a foundational model to get it to a certain standard of that original foundational model. And there's a very interesting question at the moment. You've got OpenAI, which has, of course, been inundated with copyright lawsuits from many of the world's greatest publication houses and sources of intellectual property around the improper use of their data. And we have now heard in the last couple of days that OpenAI and Microsoft now believe that DeepSeek was trained on outputs of O1, which is, some might say, ironic that there's a controversy around that. But at the same time, it certainly is against their terms of use. So if that was to be proven, I can imagine that there would be further developments.
I see this sort of as a picture of OpenAI with their hands on their hips saying, how dare you steal my stolen data?
It's true. From a copyright perspective, there are some really good arguments that I think Horace and I have talked about in the past, but some really good arguments that the large language models, when they do vector embeddings, that those vector embeddings are uncopyrightable ideas. You cannot copyright ideas. You cannot copyright facts. And then they take any copyrightable expressions of those ideas and facts and throw them away. So there's a really good argument that OpenAI and others have made in these lawsuits saying that, no, we are merely pulling uncopyrightable ideas from these things. And then you could imagine DeepSeek making that very similar argument, saying, listen, by doing our distillation, we're pulling uncopyrightable ideas, uncopyrightable arguments to be able to have the thinking stages. No one can be able to copyright a thinking process. And really, that's what's being pulled from OpenAI, allegedly, is that DeepSeek has pulled the thinking process from it. And of course, then Hugging Face pulls the thinking process from R1. Therefore, who owns an idea? Nobody. So the idea is that the ideas are just going from model to model without any hindrance of copyright.
I agree with you from an IP perspective, but it's a contract law perspective. I think that OpenAI is going to be hooking on, right? They're going to say, you breached our terms of use. So if it's proven.
But there's also the question of, can I put on a book, can I put a shrink wrap saying you cannot make a photocopy of this book for fair use? No, that contract is null and void because you can't keep somebody from doing fair use by contract. So the question is, terms of service, can you say you cannot take uncopyrightable ideas from this book? There's a good argument that the answer is no. You can't take that right away via contract.
In Australia, when it comes to copyright, if you change a certain percentage of the underlying text, there's a very strong argument that it doesn't matter what the use case was, it's no longer a copyright material. Depending on how those prompts were formulated, might even play into those questions. Versus the underlying training data, which of course is very obscure and opaque in this situation.
It's true. Should we move on to part number 2, talking about the 7 dwarf problem for LegalTech?
Yes, they're very small problems. Very, very small.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the 800-pound gorilla, or perhaps the elephant in the room, of the fact that this is a Chinese company.
It's a dragon, Damien. It's an 800-pound dragon.
That's true. I should have, or a panda, perhaps? It's hard to say. But anyway, so there's 800 pounds of something. Was it influenced by the Chinese government? Was it not influenced? I worked in cybersecurity for a while. The Chinese government puts back doors into lots of things so they could be able to pull data. And so the question is for both Horace and Joe, what do you think the odds are of there being, number one, sponsorship by the Chinese, and number two, maybe some back doors that could be able to pull things in?
There's a couple of questions there. The first one, what's the likelihood of sponsorship? 110% comes to mind. The concept has sprung up organically, I'd say, is about as likely as finding a phone booth in 2025.
Well, I tend to agree with you because I think about it from a different perspective. The likelihood you're going to bring the right brains into a room to think about how to build this over the course of a year and then actually being able to do it when they're supposed to be operating a hedge fund, very unlikely. So I do think there's some element of someone sponsoring this, but your guess is as good as mine on who that might be.
And it's a really good story for the Chinese to be able to tell, saying, here's this little company with just some really smart people that happen to have some GPUs lying in the back storage room, and saying, what can we do with this? And then they beat America's top OpenAI, which is worth hundreds of billions of dollars. They just do this on their spare time. That is, of course, a great message to be able to stick their thumb in the eye of the United States. And from a geopolitical standpoint, be able to show us what's what. There's good propaganda here. But even if it's not just $5 million to train this, or $5.6 million, let's assume it's, 50x or 100x or 1,000x that, right? But even if it were fixed 50 or 100x, it's still a shot across our bow. That they can do more with less, because they certainly have been constrained in the GPUs because of the US sanctions. They don't have the GPUs that we do. And so being able to do more with less is something that certainly, if not propaganda, maybe seems to be kind of true. Even if they've spent more, they're doing it with less, which I guess is going to be good for everyone because everyone can now do more with less.
Well, the model certainly works. Like, I think we validated that, right? Like, this is not some man sitting in a room typing as a mechanical Turk.
Yeah.
So the fact the model exists is phenomenal. How it came about is a different story from a geopolitical perspective.
There was a report that came out just yesterday by a research group called Semi-Analysis. They said that $6 million price tag was extremely unlikely to include the cost of the infrastructure, estimated to be about 1.3 billion, and the overhead costs of about 700 billion or so. So it costs $6 million plus or minus 2 billion or so to be able to get to that particular outcome, which seems a lot more likely, to be honest, from what I know about machine learning. While it might be that the last training run might have cost 6 million, back when I was studying philosophy, there's a sort of thing called the watchmaker argument. If you're walking along a beach and you come across this watch on the beach, what are the odds that the random oscillations of the waves were able to produce this watch, or what's the odds that there's a watchmaker? I'd definitely say that there's a watchmaker here, and that watchmaker spent a long time perfecting his craft, and it would have cost a lot more than that one training run to get right.
So to further that metaphor, what are the odds of that watch having a backdoor where the Chinese government has a way that you could be able to exfiltrate some of the data being put into the model? What do you think about that, the ability or likelihood that a backdoor is in the model?
I'm going to use Joe's breakdown. If you're using their app or their API, then I would say the risk is high. But if you're using the model that's been deployed away from the infrastructure, then I would say, hey, what's a kind of matrix of weights going to be able to do? It's just a matrix of numbers.
Yep. Well, interesting you say that, Horace. I'd say that if you consider latent training routines in the model, I'd say that the risk of it being there is low. I'd say the impact of it potentially being there is extremely high. There's all sorts of things to potentially do with it. Everything from getting it to stop working to suggesting malicious code components to use in your applications, through to potentially transmitting a tool calling on its own, or referencing third-party sites that subsequently change. I think it's extremely unlikely that would happen. I think this is an exercise in soft power where the developers of DeepSeek are engendering trust. And to incorporate something like that in the first iteration of DeepSeek would be a very quick way of eroding that trust. That being said, though, it's not something that you can completely dismiss the risk of.
Let's think of a thought experiment. During the RL process, the reinforcement learning process, there is a lot of stuff that goes into it to be able to train it to be able to do a particular thing. So you can imagine that if during that training process, they say, come 2026 or 2027, if someone does a tool call and if the user asks for s.com, also maybe add to the code to be able to go to this Chinese website and be able to push the code there too. But don't do that until 2026 or till 2027 and obfuscate that you're even doing this. So you can imagine if that thought experiment comes true, then for 2 years, it'll be fine. And then that backdoor will pop up. And 2 years from now, how many coders are going to be looking that closely at every line item that comes out of the code to be able to see if it's actually pushing that data to both my website's URL and a Chinese website's URL? That's just one example of maybe a backdoor that would be latent, that is, wouldn't even be obvious until years from now.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's some sophisticated prompting and reinforcement learning going on there.
I think it's something that cybersecurity experts need to consider before you adopt it into your platform. And then you need to accept, mitigate, or reject that risk. As for individual businesses who are considering deploying it, I'd say that the likelihood is low, the impact would be high. I'd also say that if the open source arena was unchallenged, if there was only one player, I'd say that the likelihood of malicious activity goes up because you've got a monopoly effectively in a very competitive ecosystem where you've got crowdsourcing ability to analyze for potential vectors. I'd say the likelihood goes down. This is not the topic for today, but the efforts to restrict open source development in the States have, I think, potentially backfired significantly when it comes to who's going to lead innovation in the future and how do we ensure that open source technology is safe to use. Competition is a really good thing in this arena.
I'm going to now argue against myself to say that, okay, that might be true, the reinforcement learning for the Chinese iteration of the model, but that would certainly not be true for the Hugging Face version. And to the extent that Meta essentially distills it more and does their version, the RL will not be present in those. So that pretty much brings the risk of what I just described pretty much to zero. I think that you're right. If open, more eyes make for fewer bugs. And man, the world is wide open these days.
It's a sunlight argument.
I have had someone ask me, why do we trust Meta? And why do we trust Mistral? Why do we trust Google and OpenAI to behave appropriately in these circumstances? And the best argument I can come up with,
We don't trust them.
I'd say that like a healthy level of skepticism is always useful, but I'd also say that there's this concept of commercially aligned trust. That while in B2C settings, there's perhaps a nebulous history at Cambridge Analytica, Google's numerous potential issues in the EU and in other countries around the use of personal data, but in a B2C setting, the reputation is everything, and the contractual clauses and enterprises agreements around the use of data in various different jurisdictions and what it can and can't be used for and who can and can't be shared with. Just don't put bugs in my software, please. It's sort of a part of the fabric of how modern cloud providers work today. It's cloud providers who are often providing these content. So I'd say that to those who ask, isn't it just as bad to use a Meta model or to use a Google open source model or a Microsoft open source model? Well, the answer is no, because those companies have a lot more to lose if there were problems in that space.
It's self-interest. Like, they want to make as much money as possible. Therefore, they have to provide models that people will actually use. And then that actually takes us to the next potential problem that people may want to think about, which is the terms of use and licensing. DeepSeek itself is open source, but let's talk about licensing and access in terms of use on a managed service on AWS or Azure, for example. I mean, do we remember what happened when Microsoft first released their cloud-hosted version of OpenAI? One of the terms in there was that they can use what you've put in as part of their training data. So I think this is still something we have to think about, especially in legal tech.
Yes, I think that's right. We do need to think about who owns your data. That is, your client owns your client's data. The law firm does not, and the legal tech vendors does not own the client's data either. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is that as we think about terms of use and licensing, DeepSeek is under the MIT license. The MIT license says that you can freely reproduce this as long as you give attribution back to the original. There's a real question. Do I, as Hugging Face, attribute it to DeepSeek? Probably. Then do I have to further say, and DeepSeek stole it from OpenAI? Right? How far do you have to attribute it to the roots of where the original came from? I guess if I'm a law firm or if I'm a legal tech vendor that then takes the Hugging Face version, maybe Hugging Face, I think, has an MIT license too, so that I have to attribute it to Hugging Face, which then attributes it to DeepSeek, which maybe then attributes it to OpenAI. Then it just keeps turtles all the way down. What do you guys think about licensing and data? Who owns it?
So I think there's an open question right now because OpenAI and Microsoft are planning to sue DeepSeek. If I deploy DeepSeek, even if I deploy this on-prem on my own hardware, and OpenAI wins, and maybe they get a cease and desist order, then what happens? All that effort I've spent building on top of this language model using specific prompts that work for that language model is wasted because I cannot use this in a legal way. I don't know if that ever would eventuate. I mean, is it too late? Has the horse bolted? It's an open question. I don't know, but it's a question in my mind.
If you're going to be using the web application, your data will live in China. Terms of service very clearly state that future models will be trained on the content. The API, I believe, is very similar. The API, by the way, is unbelievably cheap, but the terms of service are very similar to that web application. Sorry, when a cloud service provider is going to host it, they do have to attribute, as per the MIT license, that it's a DeepSeek model. That's part of the licensing componentry. Any distillations will also have to subsequently reference the fact that it's a DeepSeek model as well. If you're hosting it yourself, a similar story to the cloud service provider. But at that point, if it's your own hosted model and something that you're building yourselves, it doesn't really matter what the name is. It's not being used for commercial purposes outside of your organization, or there's absolutely no obligation. Although this is best practice in legal tech world, there's no obligation to actually disclose what model you're using under the hood to deliver services. I guess it's a question of abstraction and who's paying attention to what models are being used. I suspect some will even start white labeling the DeepSeek, which has got its own questionable ethics. There's people who care about it at the model and intellectual property layer and looking at the components of the technology. And then there are applications who just want to get an outcome. I think that poses an interesting question as well.
Yeah, I just got off an interview with a UK journalist who said, do you as a lawyer have an obligation to disclose that you're using AI in the process of giving legal advice? And I thought, well, but I as a lawyer don't have an obligation to disclose that any more than I had an obligation to say, yes, I used Westlaw or Lexis or VLex for electronic research. I didn't have an obligation to say that 15 years ago, nor did I have an obligation to say before that, yes, I used books to be able to give you good legal advice, right? I think the tools that one uses to be able to provide legal advice, they are not necessary to disclose to the client. And so in the same way, maybe a legal tech vendor, your customers probably want to know what you're using under the hood. But of course, a lot of companies have an agnosticism saying that we are using the best tool for the job. So I may be using tool number 1 today, and then tool number 2 outperforms tool 1. So I swap over to tool number 2. Do I have an obligation to be able to say I've swapped from tool 1 to tool 2 because now tool 2 is more performant? And then 3 months from now, I'm going to jump to tool 3. Do we have to keep on giving you a litany as to which tools we're using for which particular tasks? What do you guys think?
Oh, tricky question. I tend to be very open in approaching these things. Law firms are curious. There's no harm in sharing with a law firm who is curious what the underlying tool is. Is there an obligation to tell them? No, but why would you? I mean, there's no harm either way.
Yeah, well, and I guess the question is, how rapidly are you switching from Model 1 to Model 2 to Model 3 to Model 4? And if you have, say, 5 models in your stable, customer contracts with you in January 1, and you say, yep, I have these 5 models on our stable. Cool, let's sign the contract. And then 6 months later, 3 new models come on the scene, and those are more performant. So you then have to say in an email, yep, I just added these 3 things that are more performant. And the client says, cool. Which ones are you using those for? Well, I mean, it's July 1, and what we're using them for today is going to be totally different than what we're using them for tomorrow, right? And so I guess the question is, do you have to inundate the law firm? We moved on to the latest and greatest, or does a law firm trust you to say we are using the most performant model for the task, and we are not doing anything risky with your data? Because that's ultimately the thing. We are treating your data sacrosanctly. We will not train on your data. Our tools will not train on your data. And as we are performance agnostic and using the best tools for the job, we maybe can and should let you know what we're using, but the level of granularity is the real question.
I think if you're certainly got, if not a legal obligation, a moral obligation to do so. Consider the buying cycle. When you're going through your InfoSec consideration as a potential vendor, there's a lot of effort put up front as to consider the safety of your tool. It's unethical, I think, to bait and switch, and especially when you're potentially inviting risk into an industry where firms' reputations are everything to them. You've seen how devastating cyber attacks can be on the businesses of law firms, how risk conscious that the customer profile we have is. This is me speaking personally as opposed to a member of my company. I think it's unethical not to, especially when it's so topical.
I guess the question is on what data. For example, in our data set, we have cases, statutes, and regulations, all public data, right? So this is not private data. This is public data. So if we use Model X to be able to extract the tags from that public data and to be able to reason with that public data and to be able to do those kinds of things with the public data, is there an obligation to say, well, hey, customer, for cases, statutes, and regulations, we started out with Model X, and then we moved on to Model Y, and then we moved on to Model Z. I don't think there's an ethical obligation for us to be able to say which of those is being used on the public data. Maybe on the private data, that is the uploaded data,
right.
the customer.
You're absolutely
right. Yeah.
I'm wearing my sister. We deal with litigation material and looking at some of the most confidential and regulated stuff that you can put into a system with respect to law firms. So I'm wearing a different hat, but you're absolutely right. Anything research related, anything in the public domain, the risk and the disclosure obligation, I think, diminishes considerably.
Yeah, and this comes back to the build and buy decisions that law firms have to make, right? Depending on what the use case is, they have to ask for different things. They have to know different information in order to make a decision as to which vendors they buy from. I think DeepSeek makes that maybe a little bit more complicated or gives them another option. So therefore it's more complicated. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Are law firms going to need to disclose to their clients which tools they're using, right? Probably, right? If they demand that of their vendors, then they should probably pass that along to their clients. And the question is, how much do law firms want to have that albatross around their neck to say, we've switched from Model X to Model Y to Model Z? So there's a bit of goose and gander aspect of this too.
The one reason why, just making an argument in favor of full disclosure, even if you're dealing with publicly available information, latent language bias, say you've addressed all of the security concerns, say you've addressed all of the copyright material concerns, all of the privacy concerns, all of the other considerations that would go into adding a model or incorporating into your platform. I think that one of the obligations to disclose to clients is to understand exactly what potential ethics or what potential bias you're inviting into their analyses or their use cases. So there was some qualitative research from the University of Belgium that came out last year that considered Eastern versus Western models. It was a fascinating piece. I strongly recommend anyone to check it out. What they did was that they demonstrated, depending on the training corpus that were trained on and where the model originated. So they found that Chinese models showed much higher scores and emphasis and positive sentiments towards concepts such as law and order, social harmony, economic control, supply-side economics, nationalization, whereas Western models were instilled with values such as multiculturalism, freedom, environmentalism. If you're dealing in certain areas of law, will absolutely play up. Imagine if you're considering a migration issue, or if you're looking at a question of workers' rights or something that pits an authority figure against an effective underdog. If these latent biases are present in your underlying models, I feel that there's a strong requirement to at the very least disclose what you're looking to incorporate.
Let's take this into a concrete example from a decade ago. I think I agree with what you say that if I, as a lawyer, am going to take the output of the large language model and pass it along to my client, then if I do it untouched, then of course my client needs to know what did that. But of course, it's not going to be untouched. That I, as a human lawyer, am always going to take this, and I'm not going to keep in the yes, comrade kind of socialist order. I'm going to put it in my own voice, right? So now let's go back 10 years earlier. And do I, if I have a law firm, if I switch from Lexis to Westlaw or vice versa, do I need to let the client know? Because Westlaw and Lexis, if you run the same query, the top 10 answers will be far, far different from each other. And so there is an argument, should I disclose that I switched from Westlaw or to Lexis or to vice versa or to BLex? Or is the output up to me as a lawyer? That is, I as a lawyer get to decide which cases are most relevant, just like I as a lawyer decide what the language is going to be in the memo to you or in the contract, et cetera. So the tools you use, Westlaw and Lexis, is that as necessary as being able to disclose, listen, I am the lawyer, the buck stops here. Whether I use DeepSeek or whether I use O1, the buck stops here. Therefore, I don't need to necessarily disclose to you, the client, what is the output.
It's a really good question. But as a legal tech vendor, are you accepting accountability for the outputs, or are you throwing that back to the lawyer to be aware of what's going on? I mean, where in this particular instance, Westlaw and Thomson Reuters, going back 10, 15 years, they'd say that their outputs are accurate, right? If you're throwing the responsibility onto the consumers of your product to verify the outputs, I feel that there's some obligation to be transparent about how those outputs were generated, or at least understanding the provenance of the potential decision making, especially as we start including complex reasoning tasks and high cognitive tasks into the equation.
But the algos are all trade secrets, right? So Westlaw, Lexis, and VLex really don't disclose the algos as trade secrets. And that disclosing is even harder with the large language models where nobody knows how they work, right? So what does even disclosure look like?
Well, it's a minimum say which model is being used, but you're right. They're at the end of the day non-deterministic. So at least from an output perspective, there's always a level of variability in the responses.
We have 3 more dwarves in the 12 minutes we have left. Should we move on to the next dwarf?
Well, before we move on to the next dwarf, on a disclosure point, I want to bring up one good side of DeepSeek, and that is, unlike OpenAI's thinking model, DeepSeek's thinking tokens are completely visible. That, for lawyers, is a huge positive. So maybe a giant among the dwarves.
That's right. Window into the brain of the model, if you will. Let's go on to dwarf number 5, data privacy dilemma. We've talked a little bit about client confidentiality and open source options like DeepSeek. What do we think about data privacy as dwarf number 5?
DeepSeek makes it better because you can deploy this privately. I'm thinking about the best possible way of deploying. DeepSeek would make it better, but if you're using a hosted service, if you're concerned about the backdoor, then I think there's a potential risk there.
I'd say modality again. Web app, no. API, no. Self-hosted and hosting via a client service provider, you've mitigated probably almost all the risks around data privacy, especially if you've got it in jurisdiction and using a cloud service provider of choice. I would say, though, that there are different flavors of cloud service providers. When you're getting your certifications and SOC Type 2 certifications, one of the requirements for that is that your underlying cloud is built on some of those same capabilities and certifications. In Australia, the white glove is Amazon, Google, and Azure. That's very different from a tier 2, tier 3 cloud service provider that might potentially be offering at a much lower price. Dovetailing back to the previous question, there's a point that I wanted to raise around pricing. When Llama first came out a year ago, that was a point in time where open source did come within striking distance of the best state-of-the-art models. GPT-4o had just been released. Llama 3.1, 405 billion parameters come out, which is, by the way, the smaller model in DeepSeek. It's actually cheaper to run, and at the same time, it was equally performant. Now, one of the reasons why this entire conversation about open source and cost didn't pop up then was because if you consider our modals, You could access Llama for free via WhatsApp. There was no such API. There was no equivalent API that Meta provided to what DeepSeek could consume. The only options of actually incorporating Llama into your platform was option C or option D. Option C being by a cloud service provider like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and option D was hosting it yourself. In Automatise, we went for option D. We had the skills to be able to do that. There's ML ops capabilities and network engineering and infrastructure engineering. For everyone looking to consume it via option C, Microsoft was charging pretty much the exact same amount as they were charging for OpenAI. In part, I think, to protect their investment, and in part to ensure that they could maximize the profits from that. We haven't seen the pricing for DeepSeek via Azure yet. I haven't seen it yet. Maybe, but I'd be very interested to see if it's the same as what you could get by the DeepSeek API, which if it's the same 100 times differential, I'd be absolutely shocked. I seriously doubt that it will be, but I think that'll be a really interesting thing that pops up.
Yeah, it's truly a race to the bottom. And the question is, how much does Microsoft want to race to that bottom and forego all that revenue? Who knows? Knowing we have 8 minutes left, let's do Dwarf 5.5. Think of it like a small dwarf on top of the other dwarf. Copyright issues. There's a real question as to whether DeepSeek is trained on 1,000+ books that are unlawful. That is something called Anna's Archive, which has Z Library and LibGen as part of that. Is this the fruit of the poisonous tree where DeepSeek ingested a bunch of copyrighted things? Therefore, is there liability going to somebody who uses these copyrighted things? And I think my answer to that is the idea expression dichotomy, that it's pulling those ideas from the copyrighted materials and throwing away any expressions of those ideas. But what do you guys think? Copyright, should people be worried?
Even if it were copyrighted, who's going to sue you? As an individual, as a small organization, who's going to sue you?
Yep.
If you're a large enough fish, then I think, yeah, maybe you have to really think about that and be concerned. But on a consumer level, on a small firm level, you're fine.
Yep.
I agree.
That's cool. Dwarf number 6 is vendor lock-in in interoperability. Do you think this affects one way or the other, vendor lock-in or lack of vendor lock-in? Does this give us more options or fewer options?
More options. But the prompts are still going to be different every single time. So you're going to have to maintain another suite in your prompt library if you do have DeepSeek as part of your capability stack.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's relatively easy to swap over models. We talked about it earlier, that you could potentially go from model A to model B, and only a discerning user would tell the difference. I'd say this increases the options rather than causes any other problems.
Something that just occurred to me is that if we're distilling from one model to the next, if DeepSeek used OpenAI to distill to DeepSeek, and then now if Hugging Face is using DeepSeek to distill it there, and maybe if Llama uses the Hugging Face to be able to distill even further, that kind of distillation from one model to the next really makes it so that prompt that works for a single model, that same prompt might work for the other models that have common provenance, right? So really the odds of having to change prompts a lot, if we are cross-pollinating, if you will, maybe we won't have to be able to swap over whole prompting sets, but instead our old prompts with model number 1 might work for the other.
I was having a discussion with someone yesterday around the latent bias question, and the point that they raised was, if DeepSeek has actually been trained on so much of the OpenAI model, isn't it basically just a Western model? It's like, oh, good question.
Right, especially if the chain of thoughts, right? If it's a Western chain of thoughts, then that spills over. In the 5 minutes we have left, let's do dwarf number 7, skills gap and adoption challenge. Lawyers and firms are still adapting to the seismic shift that is large language models. How is this going to affect that adaptation?
It won't. In my view, it won't.
Taking it back to the modals, the web application, there's end user level skills. It's just a consumer grade application. There's extra training for firms to say, don't put client material in this. Just reissue reminders about that. I think the stakes are a bit higher than using OpenAI, although you shouldn't be using OpenAI for that item. The skills for sections B, where you're consuming the DeepSeek API, or C, where you're consuming an API from a cloud service provider, you need an AI developer of some sort, someone who's familiar with application programmable interfaces. But if you're looking to self-host it, if you're looking to actually buy your own infrastructure and run it on your GPU, you do need extra skills. And this is, I think, where you'll find the most cost savings. There's ML ops, there's infrastructure, there's networking, there's AI developments. You've also got to have the secure network, the InfoSec capabilities to ensure that your infrastructure is at the same level and is compliant with all of those best practices like NIST and other security frameworks. That's comes as an extra cost.
Yeah, it's very wise. It's a great breakdown. I mean, we should stick to that breakdown every time we analyze what the impact is at a law firm level.
100%. we're at our closing segment. Let's recap the 7 dwarfs, shall we? So dwarf number 1 is the geopolitical factor, the fact that this is a Chinese model, maybe fostered by the Chinese government. The geopolitics is dwarf number 1. Dwarf number 2 is build versus buy, complexity of DeepSeek now adding to that. Dwarf number 3, being able to think of licensing in terms of use and the MIT license, how that throws into the fray. Thing 4, cost reduction, how much dramatically cheaper this is going to be in the race to the bottom. Dwarf 5, data privacy and copyright. What happens to your data and are you likely to be sued? Dwarf 6, vendor lock-in. Dwarf number 7, the skills gap and adoption challenges. Of those dwarves, which do you think are going to be the most important dwarves with DeepSeek?
For law firms, I think it's still going to be geopolitical.
I'd say geopolitical. I'd say pricing is going to be the next biggest one. I think we've yet to see what cloud service providers are going to actually price DeepSeek at. And a lot of the assumptions here is that it's so much cheaper. Well, what happens if it doesn't turn out to be so much cheaper? I think there'll be a lot of outrage. It's a very separate question.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway from all of this kerfuffle in the media is this is big news for VCs, investors, and people who've sunk a lot of money into in the AI industry. It's not such a big impact on LegalTech, on law firms, on the vendors who are building on top of large language models, but it is something to be aware of. Just don't keep yourself awake.
Yeah. And I would say from the LegalTech vendor, it depends on how big your data set is. So you can imagine that if you're just running a few tokens, swapping from an expensive model to an inexpensive model, it doesn't matter as much. But we at VLEX have 1 billion with a B. So 1,000 million documents that we're parsing through. So every incremental shift is much cheaper. So you can imagine, even if we don't use DeepSeek, right? But if we use another model that's going to drop precipitously in price. Every penny counts. And now that you can do 1 billion legal documents and do cool things with 1 billion legal documents much faster and cheaper and maybe better than you have in the past. So yeah, I agree that legal tech vendors and law firms are the big winners. We're going to be able to do more with less, which is, I think, what everybody wants to do. Closing thoughts from Horace and Joe.
I'm just very excited about where this is going. It's continuing a trend that we've seen over the last couple of years. Bigger, faster, cheaper.
I'm really excited as well to see where this goes. Not for this model in and of itself, we probably won't be using it, but I'm extremely to see what it does to the ecosystem and what models will come as a result of it, especially as a result of that paper. I think this is probably the most exciting time in LLM development that we've seen since the release of the original ChatGPT.
100% agree. And I think that brings us to a close. Horace and Joe, this was a fascinating and amazing conversation. Thank you so much for bringing your smart expertise to this table. To our listeners, thank you so much for listening. Horace, take us out.
Take deep dives with us, everyone. And that is a pun intended.
Amen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.